In the year 1453, a 21-year-old sultan would achieve what countless Muslim rulers had dreamed of for over 8 centuries. His name was Mehmed II, but history would remember him as Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who finally brought down the last remnant of the mighty Byzantine Empire. Picture this: Constantinople, the city that had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years. Its massive walls stretching across the Bosphorus like an impenetrable fortress. Emperors, caliphs, and sultans had all tried and failed to breach these legendary defenses. But this young Ottoman ruler was different. He possessed something his predecessors lacked: an unshakable belief that he was destined to fulfill the Prophet Muhammad's ancient prophecy about conquering this great Christian stronghold. From his earliest days, Mehmed was obsessed with one singular goal. While other princes played with toys, he studied siege warfare. While they learned poetry, he mastered military engineering. His tutors noticed something extraordinary about this boy: an intensity that burned like fire in his eyes whenever Constantinople was mentioned. His father, Sultan Murad II, had attempted to take the city twice and failed both times. But Mehmed wasn't discouraged by these failures. He was inspired by them. He spent years analyzing every detail of those failed sieges, learning from every mistake, preparing for the moment when he would get his chance. When Mehmed ascended to the throne in 1451, he was barely 19 years old. Many thought he was too young, too inexperienced to lead the mighty Ottoman Empire. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI certainly thought so. He made the fatal mistake of underestimating this young sultan, even going so far as to demand increased tribute payments. Mehmed's response was swift and decisive. He would not pay a single coin. Instead, he would take the entire city. The young sultan immediately began preparations for what would become one of history's most legendary sieges. He commissioned the casting of massive cannons, weapons so large that it took 60 oxen and 400 men just to move them into position. But Mehmed's genius wasn't just in his military might, it was in his strategy. He knew that Constantinople's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The city was surrounded by water on 3 sides, with only one land approach heavily fortified. The Golden Horn, a natural harbor, was protected by a massive chain that prevented enemy ships from entering. Previous attackers had always focused on the land walls, the strongest part of the city's defenses. Mehmed had a different plan. If he couldn't sail his ships into the Golden Horn, he would simply carry them overland. In one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history, he had his entire fleet of 70 ships dragged across land, up and over a hill, and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The defenders woke up one morning to find Ottoman warships in waters they thought were completely secure. The siege lasted 57 days, and every single day Mehmed was there, personally directing the assault, inspiring his troops, adjusting his tactics. This wasn't some distant ruler commanding from a palace. This was a hands-on military commander who shared the dangers and hardships of his soldiers. His massive cannons, designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, pounded the ancient walls day and night. The largest of these weapons could fire stone balls weighing over 600 kilograms, and the sound of their bombardment could be heard from kilometers away. But the walls of Constantinople were incredibly thick, built to withstand medieval siege weapons. Even Mehmed's supercannons made slow progress. As the siege dragged on, both sides began to feel the strain. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine knew he was fighting for the survival of an empire that had lasted for over 1,000 years. He had only about 7,000 defenders against Mehmed's army of more than 100,000. But Constantine was determined to fight to the end, and his small force of Byzantine Greeks, Genoese mercenaries, and other volunteers fought with the desperation of men who knew they were making their last stand. Outside the walls, Mehmed faced pressure from his own advisors, many of whom thought the siege was taking too long and costing too much. Some even suggested that perhaps God didn't want them to take the city after all. But Mehmed never wavered. He had studied the prophecies, he had prepared for this moment his entire life, and he believed with absolute certainty that Constantinople would fall. On the night before the final assault, he gave one of history's most inspiring speeches to his troops. He reminded them that they were fighting not just for conquest, but for the glory of Islam, for the fulfillment of their prophet's words, for their place in history as the generation that finally achieved what their fathers and grandfathers had only dreamed of. When dawn broke on May 29, 1453, the final assault began. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers hurled themselves at the walls. The first attacks were repelled, the second wave was driven back, but Mehmed kept sending more men forward. Then, in a moment that would change history forever, a small group of Ottoman soldiers found a partially open gate in the wall. They poured through this tiny opening and began attacking the defenders from behind. At almost the same moment, a giant of a man named Hassan the Janissary managed to climb over the wall and plant the Ottoman flag on the ramparts. When the defenders saw that Ottoman flag flying above their city, their resistance began to crumble. Emperor Constantine, realizing that all was lost, made a decision that would ensure his place in history as one of the great tragic heroes. He removed his imperial regalia so that his body couldn't be identified, drew his sword, and charged into the melee. He died fighting like a common soldier, defending his city to the very end. His body was never definitively identified among the thousands of dead. Meanwhile, Mehmed had achieved his life's ambition. At 21 years old, he had accomplished what seasoned generals and mighty emperors had failed to do. Constantinople, the city that had been the eastern capital of Christendom for over a millennium, was now in Muslim hands. But what happened next showed the true character of this remarkable young sultan. Instead of allowing his troops to sack and destroy the city, as was the custom after such sieges, Mehmed immediately moved to protect Constantinople's inhabitants and preserve its treasures. He declared that while his soldiers could take plunder for 3 days, as was their right, they could not harm civilians or destroy buildings. He personally visited the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Eastern Christian world, and declared that it would become a mosque, but that its magnificent architecture and artwork would be preserved. This wasn't just political pragmatism. This was a young ruler who understood that he wasn't just conquering a city, he was inheriting a civilization. Mehmed renamed the city Istanbul and made it the new capital of his expanding empire. He immediately began a massive reconstruction program, bringing in Muslim, Christian, and Jewish settlers from across his domains. He rebuilt the infrastructure, established new schools and hospitals, and turned Istanbul into one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Within decades, it would become larger and more prosperous than it had ever been under Byzantine rule. But perhaps most remarkably, Mehmed continued his conquests. This young man who had already achieved immortality by taking Constantinople was just getting started. He went on to conquer Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and much of Greece. He built a navy that challenged Venetian control of the Mediterranean. He even planned to march on Rome itself, believing that if he could take the western capital of Christendom as well as the eastern one, he could reunite the old Roman Empire under Islamic rule. Mehmed the Conqueror died in 1481 at the age of 49, still planning new campaigns, still dreaming of new conquests. In his short life, he had transformed the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a global superpower that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. But his greatest achievement wasn't just military, it was cultural and religious. By taking Constantinople, he had proven that no fortress was impregnable, no empire was eternal, and that a young man with absolute faith in his destiny could change the course of world history. The conquest of Constantinople marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Ottoman Age, an era that would see Islamic civilization reach new heights of power, prosperity, and cultural achievement.